since we're here in this family, let me tell you a short abstract of what I'm going to talk about so that you can decide if you want to stay, or there's a great cafe here, I hear. It's really a story about this Jewish guy that goes into a life insurance office and says, I'd like to have a life insurance. And the clerk looks at him and says, excuse me, how old are you? And he says, I'm 100 years old. And the clerk says, you're kidding, we're not giving life insurance to 100 years old. And he said, no, that's not true, my mother is insured here. So he said, how old is your mother? She's 120. And is she okay? Yeah, she's okay. So let me actually pause for a second. CNN today, just before I left, I saw that the oldest person in the world died today at 116. By the way, the oldest person in the world used to be 122, and they're getting younger, which we can talk about it. 116 is not so impressive, but anyhow, she died today. So his mother is 120 and she's doing fine, so the clerk goes to the boss and they said, you know, this is a good public relation, why don't we just give him? And so they said, listen, why don't you come on Tuesday and we'll have everything ready for you to sign? And he said, you know, I'm sorry, I'm busy on Tuesday. So they look at him, 100 years old, what are you doing on Tuesday? He said, it happens that in Tuesday, my grandfather is getting married. Your grandfather is getting married, how old is your grandfather? He said, 150. 150 and he wants to get married? He said, he doesn't want to, but his parents puts lots of pressure. Okay. There are lots of problems with this story. Among them, it's just a story. But it gives you kind of an introduction to my world, okay? And I'll try to be more scientific from now on. I called it my recipe for the future or my recipe for aging, and that's kind of what we are trying to achieve. We're trying to really have a strategy to delay aging and age-related diseases. Our focus is good quality of life without diseases, and not necessarily longevity, but I'll tell you how longevity plays a role here, and I'll also make a comment at the end about Moses, okay? So I'm going to ask you several questions. By the way, I'm planning to talk for maybe 30 minutes. I'll show you also 2 clips of movies, but I really would like to spend some time in answering your questions, okay? So I'm going to ask you, though, several questions during the lecture in order to make a point. So, you know, I'm hoping that you'll give me the wrong answers, okay? That's what I'm hoping, so don't be shy. So I'm going to ask you, first of all, do you think that aging is mainly a result of our interaction with the environments, or it's mainly the genetic makeup that we have? Now, think about it. Think of what you know about aging, about you, your friends, your parents, anything like that. And now I have to tell you that it's an interaction, really. It's really an interaction of the environment of the genes, but take a leadership position here and decide what's more important. If you think that it's more the environment, raise your hands and everybody looks around. If you think the environment is the major thing, good. And those of you who think it's genetics, raise your hands. Okay. I think because of what you know about me, more of you really voted for genetics, but it was a kind of a split answer. And let me tell you that if it was the board of geriatrics, the correct answer would be 80% environment and 20% genetics. But I have to tell you, it all depends who's asking this question, okay? This question is asked by demographers. And demographers take data that they have, for example, the relationship between age of death of children and their parents. And they look at their relationship, they draw a line, and they calculate what they think is the impact of the heritability. And it's very complex. I'll give you an example from my family. My grandfather was 68 when he got a heart disease and died. My father was 68 when he got a heart disease. So you see the genetics is kind of similar for cardiovascular disease. But my father had a triple bypass, and he lived and died at the age of 84. And actually what happened between them is the environment, right? Medical progress is really part of the environment. And that's what changed. But it just gives you an example to show that it's a little complex to say what's genetic and what environment. And I have to tell you, and for this audience, it's the nature-nurture question that we're all dealing in not only in medicine, in other fields. And in medicine, we're asking the same questions with obesity and diabetes and other things. And I would just tell you philosophically for me, because we are with our sets of genes in this environment, it's a 50-50 collaboration, okay? And as long as you know that the environment is important and the genetic is important, you can work on both sides. And actually, if we can find what are the genetic parts and have a strategy because of the genetics to see how we protect against the environment, it'll be great. Because the genetic can be translated into drugs. The environment, we have to do things that are more difficult, okay? So let me give you just an example of the environment also to show you. I'm going to talk about these genetic studies for longevity, but I have a lab that's doing other things, and I'll show you just one result in our lab and really showing how the environment modulates lifespan. We take rats that are brothers, and half of them we give whatever they want to eat, and half of them we give 60% of what their brothers are eating. And we're looking if they live shorter or longer. And this is the result. Those are the guys, the AL stands for ad libidum feeding, they eat whatever they want. And those are the animals that are calorically restricted. And both their half maximal life and maximal lifespan are increased by about 40%. And this is a study that I repeated for some other reason in my lab, but it's repeated by many other. I just got the results that everybody gets. And the point here, they're genetically the same. All we change is the calories. And by the way, the calories, it didn't matter if you gave them the calories more from fat or more from carbohydrates or more from protein. It really didn't matter much. It's the number of calories that were important here. Let me just make one comment. I don't believe that caloric restriction is important in humans. In other words, it is important for obese people to get thinner. And I think that there's evidence that it will increase their lifespan. So obese people will probably live longer by losing weight. But actually the weight that is associated with the less mortality, the perfect weight in humans is in the border between normal weight and overweight. If you know the BMIs, if your doctor tells you the BMI, it's about 25, okay? Or if you want to look at it differently, it's my BMI that is the perfect, and that's my excuse of not losing more weight. So I'm not telling you that I'm not showing you this as saying that caloric restriction is important for humans necessarily. This study has not been done. I'm just giving you an example where you can take a model and change the environment and it will have an effect. And we'll get back to the environment later. So you did beautifully. You kind of split it the way I wanted you to split. And now I'm asking another question. And I'm asking you, do you think that we humans age at different rates? In other words, think of people who are 60 years old. I'm just picking an age. Do you know some 60 years old that look more like they are 50? Do you know some 60 years old that look more like they are 70? If you do, if you believe that we humans age at different rates, please raise your hands and everybody look at it. Okay, thank you. So first of all, please, you're connected to Einstein. Don't tell them that I asked this question, because you know we professor ask a question in order to divide our audience, like I did before, not to unite them like that. But the real main point is that we all intuitively understand that there are different rates of aging. So why don't we try to figure out why there's such a discrepancy between the chronological age, our birthdays, and the biological age? And maybe that's how you can understand why I went to 100 years old, because I think this is a group that basically their aging was slower. So maybe we can discover more things in this group than others. Okay, so that's kind of what you can intuitively understand and why we're doing what we're doing. Let me, as part of an introduction, show you another slide, and you see that. Let me just get. Okay, let me just get my. Okay, so. This part of the slide is from the government, and that's why it's not a good quality, okay? So I'm going to make it a little bit better, and I'm putting here lines, and those lines are showing the relationship between deaths and age. And the lines here are for cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and Alzheimer's. And if you notice, the scale here is a logarithmic scale. It goes from 1 to 10 to 100. So it's not an increase in 10% or two-folds. It's nothing like that. And it just shows you that for those diseases and others, aging is a major risk factor. The risk of getting old takes you to any one of diseases from having a risk of 1 to have a risk of 1,000. Now, we all know that cholesterol is a risk factor for heart disease. And if you go to the web of the National Institute of Health, Lung and Blood Institute, you would see that that's the main risk for cardiovascular disease, and it's a 3-fold risk. You have 3-fold chances of dying if you have cholesterol. But with aging, the risk is 100-fold. And actually, in the site of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood, they don't put aging as a risk at all. So if aging is such a risk, us people in the biology of aging are looking at that and are saying, you know what, if we're not going to delay aging, we're not going to have an impact on the diseases of aging. We can have impact on one disease. And in fact, that's what happened with cardiovascular. You know, cardiovascular disease is a success. We know how to prevent it, you know, by drugs and exercise and aspirin and those things that you know. We know how to treat cardiovascular. If you have a myocardial infarction, you go to the hospital, you'll get a stent, you get a bypass, you'll get drugs. But you know what happened to the people who now survive cardiovascular disease or heart attack? Within 2 years, they have diabetes or cancer or Alzheimer. Because all we did is we fixed specifically the heart. We didn't delay the aging part. So the aging is a much more important target for everyone than to start dealing with specific diseases of aging. And that's really the message that we're trying to get out there. And it's of course difficult because you have to do it through politicians and even when it comes to the NIH, every institute is protecting their own turf, you know, so the diabetes want to do diabetes and the heart wants to do the heart, and the aging is getting 3% of the funding when when 80% of the medical costs are in people over the age of 65, and that's where we are. And that's why part of the importance of this research is to prove the concept that it's worthwhile to look at the aging side and you get more bang for your money. Okay, so now I'll talk a little bit about my study. So this is how it started. We thought, to be 100 years old is very rare. When we started, it was 1 out of 10,000 in the United States. It's actually like 1 of 5,000 now, because more people are getting to this age that are partly bionic. They have replacement and pacemakers and things like that, and other medical progress. But it was 1 to 10,000, so it's very rare. It's very important for genetics to have something rare. This is more rare than having cystic fibrosis. Okay, much more rare than having cystic fibrosis, which is a rare monogenetic disease. So it's a rare thing. And so we started collecting, and we have almost 600 people that basically have to be relatively healthy at age 95, living independently. And we have people with variety of age between 95 and 112 that were recruited to these studies. As we recruited those people, other groups and us, unfortunately not too many other groups, but the few groups that were looking at centenarians, we all discover one very important thing, that it's in the family, that there is heritability for that. Why do you think you live to be 100? Well, my mother was 102 and my grandfather was 108. You get those stories. So you have a very rare occurrence, and it's in the family. So we started forming hypotheses, and I'll show you the 2 hypotheses that we had in order to take one a little bit off the table now, okay? And one hypothesis is that, we found many causes of diseases. We have genes for cardiovascular disease, we have genes for diabetes, we have genes for Alzheimer. So maybe the 100 years old just don't have all those bad genes. And we already know that it's not true. In fact, they have, in majority of cases, they have just as many bad genotypes, changes in their genes, in the bad genes, as the rest of the population. So it's not that their genetic makeup is better in this sense. They don't have the perfect genome in this sense. So this leads to number 2. And number 2 is that it's not that they have perfect genome, but in their genome, they have something that protects them against everything else that they have. They have a longevity gene, or they have a protective gene. And those are the things that we're discovering and working on, and those are the discoveries that are leading now to development of drugs. So I'd like now to introduce you to one family. Those are 4 children that were born to 2 parents in New York between 1910 and 1920. The first kid died, the sister that's standing there on the right, died at the age 102, to the shock of everybody there. The old sister died at age 110, exactly a year ago, and the 2 brothers are alive. One is 107 or 108 now, and one is 106. And the point here is those are the only 4 kids that were born to 2 parents in New York City. Okay, they were born like where you were born and where your parents were born. They all made it past 102, far into over 102. Showing you the genetic aspects. But what I want to do is I want to show you a clip of the brother that's sitting there with a gun, whose name is Irwin Khan, and he allowed us to use this clip. It was done 2 years ago. He's still going to work every day, And you'll see in the film that his sister, who was alive then, just dropped in for a visit. So you'll have a glance of both of them.
In this office building on Madison Avenue, New York City, 104-year-old investment advisor Irving Cohn is working hard, as he has since his career on Wall Street began in 1928. He shares his secret to a long and healthy life.
To wake up in the morning and have something to look forward to.
Irving's curiosity and keen business sense have led him to become a widely respected value investor, a member of the New York Stock Exchange, and chairman of Cohn Brothers, the company he founded more than 30 years ago with two of his sons, including Thomas, who is the president. Irving works 5 days a week with his 67-year-old son and 29-year-old grandson, Andrew.
And how are you going to link the underwriting projects?
I'll come to that.
Playing an integral part in managing over $700 million in assets. Irving's first business venture was as a boy selling newspaper subscriptions for a nickel so that he could buy a bicycle. He recalls how his father taught him to ride.
We lived on 106th Street. It was a wide street here. And he said, sit on the street and hold on to handlebars. And it gave me a push. But there I was out in the middle of the street, still not falling. What could I do? So I learned how to ride very quickly. He taught me how to swim as well. He pushed me in the water, and he said, would you rather drown or rather swim?
Irving says those were the first steps in learning how to do things for himself.
Show me the paper.
Thomas believes his father's thirst for knowledge fuels his drive.
Work is his life. So he's always been an absorber of information. Ever since I was a child, he would bring home annual reports and read them at the dinner table. And that's what he still does.
This is the Aztec website.
And Irving says not working is unthinkable.
Well, I would pay you if you took it away from me. I try to buy it back.
He believes mental challenge is key.
The important thing is to keep that brain going, you see.
50.2 million increased 20.8%.
To stay sharp, Irving reads materials online, 2 financial newspapers daily, and a wide range of nonfiction.
I read a lot of science. I read no fiction, no mystery stories, and no sex novels. So that leaves a lot of time for science.
And it was Irving's interest in science that led him to participate in the Longevity Genes Project at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, led by researcher Nir Barzilai. Nir and his team have recruited more than 500 healthy elderly, ages 95 to 112, and their children. Irving and Thomas are part of the study, as is Irving's big sister,
Muskets is 5 feet long.
108-year-old Helen Reichert, a former television host and fashion historian. She recently had a stroke, but is otherwise in excellent health. So far, Nir and his team have found several gene variants that are more common in this group and protect against cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and Alzheimer's.
Erwin has the CTP genotype that seems to be protective against several age-related diseases, including cognitive decline.
Nir's team has also found that some genes seem to protect against the effects of certain lifestyle habits. Irving, for instance, used to smoke, but quit to set an example for his children. And Helen smoked for more than 80 years.
You can see both from him and his sister that those genes have real amazing effect, not only on the fact that they're alive, but considering the fact that they were smoking and this should have shortened their lifespan immensely.
And Irving believes long life has its benefits when it comes to business.
Because part of it is some of the advantages that you have when you're older. And you know what's rotten and what's fresh and what's good and what's bad. And you can participate on a higher level of successful choices. That's me.
As Irving invests in maximizing the value of each day, Thomas appreciates his rare opportunity.
I enjoy debating with him about business subjects. And, you know, in our business you can say this is white and I can say it's black and we can argue about it.
But there's no debating that Thomas wants to follow in the footsteps of the man who showed him the ropes in business and who soldiers on every day at 104 and counting.
So I want to make sure that you understand, I was showing you this clip basically to show you that if you're healthy at 107, you can have a really good life, okay? Because, the public, when I say the public 100 years old, who wants to be 100 years old? Well, if you're healthy and have good life, you want to be 100 years old, okay? That's really the point that I want to make. He had not anymore. He's the rare ones whose wife died before.
That nobody else grabbed him.
We don't know, right? Maybe a secret life. So I want to make another point because it was partly made here, but you would say, there's another thing. Maybe those guys were just perfect with the environment. Okay, maybe they were lean, non-smoking, drinking the right amount of alcohol, exercising, maybe vegetarian, all that thing that is important. So let me show you. Overweight and obese, almost half of them were overweight or obese. Okay, so as a group, they weren't special. Smoking, 60% of the men and 30% of the women. Alcohol daily, you want to have 1 glass of wine. It's rare. Physical activity, now I'm talking about walking, cycling, housework, less than half of them. Vegetarians, 2.6% of them, okay? So the point here, as a group, we are not finding that they were unique. Even the people who said, oh no, food, was very important for us, when you ask them how come, they said, because we had chicken fat every day, or we had chocolates, or but that's what they are. And by the way, we controlled that for people who lived at that time that we had information, and they were either as good or as bad as as bad or a little worse than people in their cohort. When this study came out, that was my nightmare, that people will say, okay, there is a proof that we don't want to do what the doctors tell us to do. Now, for us, for most of us that don't have longevity in the family, we have to do what the doctors have to do. The point is, with some of those 100 years old, it really didn't matter whether they did it or not, because they were going to make it anyhow. Okay, so that's the point. And please, I don't want anybody to say, we just heard that we don't have to exercise or something like that. That's not my message. Okay, so let me tell you, so I talked with you about a bunch of 100 years old, but I'm a scientist. You don't do science on a group without having a control. Okay? And it's a problem because the people who were born in their cohort died 50 years before. So we don't have, on average, so we don't have the right control. And what we've done in this study that is unique is we recruited not only the 100 years old, but their offspring, their children. By the way, I used to have children, to write children, but now offspring, because when we got our protocol for approval and the cover letter said, we're going to look at centenarians and their offspring, it came back on my desk the next day saying and children, I mean centenarians and their children, they say for children you need other forms. Okay, but their children are 70 years old, can take care of themselves, So it's their offspring. And there's a lot of reason why we take the offspring that I'm not going to get into now, but the offspring are, we think, are enriched with those longevity genes. Let's say they have 50% of, at least, of what it takes. Some of them have more, some of them have less of what it takes. And the advantage is that for the offspring, we can have a control. We can have people that we can match with gender, and age to the offspring. And that's how we can design a study that is genetically valid, okay? And in fact, we have a study going on looking at the offspring of centenarians moving on to see how our genes influence their aging, but rather than what we did was, which is called cross-sectional in science. You know, we just took the people and their offspring and just looked at the difference. We're going to look forward now and validate our studies. The last point that is very important about our study that it's done in the Ashkenazi Jews. And the reason we do it is not that the Ashkenazi Jews are known for living longer or living shorter. We assume that they live as much as any other group. But it's a technical issue because for genetic reasons, you want to deal with a homogeneous population because otherwise the genetic noise when we do the testing is very, very large, particularly in New York. You can just walk in the street and understand the genetic noise. Just looking at skin color is a good indication of genetic noise. So the best population in the world, by the way, for genetic studies today is the Icelandics. Okay, Iceland is an island with 500,000 people who are all children of 5 Vikings and 4 Irish women. Okay, they're brothers, cousins, and so if you take this population and some of them have diabetes and some do not, you can actually find good genes for diabetes on the background. And this is the idea behind using the Ashkenazi Jews. And we believe that it's a cost saving. In other words, that we need much less people in order to get better results than if we would have gone all over and take everybody to our study. And I can talk about it more later. And just to show you where we are, I'll give you this example. This is an example of several age-related diseases: hypertension, diabetes, myocardial infarction, and stroke. And the red people are the control to the blue group that is the offspring of centenarians. And you see that the offspring of centenarians, they're the same age, and they have less hypertension, less diabetes, less myocardial infarction and stroke. So for the same age, they're healthier. But I really want to bring in the 100 years old, the centenarians in green, because although they are 30 years older than the red group, they barely have the same prevalence of hypertension, much less diabetes, and just about the same prevalence of myocardial infarction and stroke. So you see that from an age-related disease perspective, their aging was delayed by 30 years. Okay, and that gives you a glimpse of the study. The offspring are healthier, and the centenarians looks like the aging disease haven't hit them as much. Okay. Let me make another point on aging that's behind some of the thoughts we have in the field. And what you have here is just a graphic presentation that I've done that showed how youthfulness declines with age. Youthfulness. Now, when I'm saying youthfulness decline, you can measure things and they can go up or they can go down, but they're changing with age. And the things that you hear a lot about is sex hormone, both testosterone in men, estrogen in women is going down, growth hormone is going down, but what maybe you don't see clearly, there are 100 things that each one of us in the biology of aging has his own idea of what's causing aging, and so there are lots of things that we're looking at. Now, when you take each one of those lines, there are 2 things that they can represent. One is maybe they cause the aging, and they're very important because of that, because we want to know what's caused aging. The second thing is maybe you can monitor, maybe it happens with aging, maybe it's even a good marker of how old you are, but it's not going to kill you, or not going to kill you in our lifespan that is, about 100, 120 years, okay? So those are obvious things, but what haunts the field now is the fact that some of the things we're monitoring with aging are not causing and not happen with aging, but they are the protection against aging. Because, you know, when we have an infectious disease, there's an inflammatory response, right? We know what to do that. When there is the breakdown in aging, there is a lot of possibility to repair and protect and modulate and stress response and others. And so we don't know what is what. And that's very confusing, because if something goes up and it's part of the repair, we don't want to bring it down. If something goes down because it's protective, when it goes down, we don't want to get it up. And the point is best made really with what happened with the Women Health Initiative, where they decided to give women estrogen because their idea was that estrogen is going to delay the whole aging process. And indeed, when they gave estrogen, some things were better. Okay, for example, the skin was much better. But overall, the study was stopped because of cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, and breast cancer. So in fact, at the end, estrogen ended up to be pro-aging and not against aging. And again, the point here is not everything that changes, if you want to look from longevity perspective, needs to be repaired. Another way to say it, estrogen is a youthful hormone on a young body. The question is it youthful hormone on an old body? And the environment of old body is very different, and it all has to be tested. By the way, estrogen probably should or could be used between age 50 and 60 in most women. That's a time where probably there's more benefits than risk. But as you understand, I have a problem with that, because I said some people are aging sooner and some later. So the real window cannot really be determined. So we don't know. But there's probably a safe window where estrogens can be used. But really the point was just to show you an example where everybody thought, hey, estrogen will make everybody young, and it didn't, not from an age-related disease perspective. By the way, since the WHI, that is exactly 10 years ago, since they came up with their study, and people haven't given estrogen as much, the incidence of breast cancer have decreased by 25% in the United States. So it has a real effect. Okay, now just few points about the genetics, and I'm really not going to give you a lecture in genetics, and I have 5 slides to finish, so I know I'm running a little later than I thought. So what you see here is you see the cell, you know, a representation of the cell in the body, and the cell has a nucleus, and in the nucleus there are the chromosomes. So let's remove one of the chromosomes, and it looks like that, and let's start pulling this chromosome from its end and stretching it out, and eventually what you get is this double helix DNA that has the genetic code. And really what we're looking for is, we call it either mutations. Mutation, you probably understand the concept, but we call it sometimes variants or SNPs. And we're looking for those that are going to change the composition of the protein that is being produced by this code and have some hormone effect. So we're going to look at that. We're looking at that, but I just want to make a point that the environment interacts with our gene in a mechanism that's called epigenetics. It's not clear genetic. The genetics that we're born with is not changing. But the epigenetic mechanism, something that rides on the gene and tells the protein to be produced or not, is changing. And this is a lot of our effort is to find the epigenetic mechanisms of aging. But that's the only sentence I want to say for their curiosity, okay? Now, what we found is we found several genes that are associated with longevity, and I'm just going to say a word about each one of them. But what's important to know is the pattern. Each one of the line represents a certain genotype, and it doesn't matter if you understand it or not. But what we want to see is what happens to the genotype with age. And if it increases with age, from 65, and it's very representative at age 100, we say that that's a longevity genotype. Because there are more people that are 100 years old with these genotypes. So that means it could have played a role in their longevity. Now, the one that is more rare, it happens only in 2% of centenarians, is an interesting story because it represents something that happens in nature. In nature, within each species, the dwarf models live longer. In other words, the pony live longer than the horse. The small dogs live longer than the large dogs. When you do experiments in the lab and mutate the growth hormone genes or receptors, they all live longer. And a subset of our centenarians, they're not really dwarf, they're a little smaller, but they have a functional mutation in their growth hormone receptor, and we see it only in centenarians, so it's probably true also in humans. Those two are lipoprotein genes, and you see they go from 8 to 10% at age 65 to about 20% at age 100. And the thing that they're doing most commonly is they're increasing the good cholesterol, the HDL cholesterol. So if your HDL cholesterol is high and you have family history of longevity, you're on your way to longevity, I would say, at least in potential. Another one is the thyroid. The centenarians and their children are not hypothyroid. They don't have a low activity of the thyroid, but their setup is relatively lower to the rest of the population. And there's a whole hypothesis of aging that has to do with the basal metabolic rate, which is what the thyroids are doing. That if your metabolism is fast, you're just going to die sooner, and if it's slower, it'll take you longer. There's even work suggests that the heartbeats are really the best indication of longevity. So mice have 250 heartbeats per minute, and men have much less. So this is some of the idea. Okay, I'm running out of battery, so that's a good reason to stop soon. So let me just tell you that this one, the CTP, and I won't take you through this slide because of the battery and other, but basically we showed in our study and another study on non-Jewish people that if you have this variant in your genetic makeup, you're protected from Alzheimer by about 70%. So it's a really strong protection from Alzheimer's, okay? And the important thing is that Merck and Roche are actually developing a drug they are developing to increase HDL and prevent cardiovascular disease, but it will be tested also, because of our studies, will be tested also on cognitive function. So the point here is to go from genetic discovery to drug development and to testing it against aging is something that's happening, and we need it to happen more often. I just want to make a point about the cost, okay, of living longer. But the point is about the cost of living healthier. And the first point I want to make is that while people who die at 80 are sick at the last 5 years of their life, they had a heart attack, they have diabetes, they had cancer. People who were 100 years old in our study were on average sick in the last 8 months of their life. So not only they lived healthier for many years, but the time that they were sick was lower. And this has been translated to cost saving in the sense that if you die the last 2 years when you're 100, compared to the cost in the last 2 years when you're 70, is about third. Okay? About third of the cost. And not only that, the 100 years old, when they were 60, 70, they even didn't go to the doctor. So there's a lot of issues if you live longer. There's social security, there's retirement, there's lots of issues. And I'm not going to be an expert to comment on them, but at least for medical costs, there's a cost saving to be healthy. So just a word about Moses. And for me, the most amazing thing is that people are, religious people, believe in every word that says that's written in the Bible, okay? When I come to this, they say, they didn't know to count. You know, all of a sudden, this is nonsense, okay? It's kind of an amazing. Certainly, longevity genes drowned with a flood. You see here with Noah? There's an interaction with the environment, right? Also, please note that Joseph lived relatively short to the guys at that time, which shows you that even then to be a secretary with the Pharaoh wasn't really great, right? Why did Moses live to 120? Did he live to 120 is a different issue, but I would say that one part of it is, by the way, considering the fact that the last 40 years were a bunch of complainers in the desert, right? But I think that part of it is that they were partially, maybe adequately, caloric restricted and exercising. So it could have contributed to, apparently Moses' longevity was unique compared to the other people in the tribe. And so, maybe there is some interaction with the environment that helped him. Now, I want to just tell you about Frieda, who's coming with me to lectures all over the world. Her son, Jerry, is here, and he's married to Bernice. They are my in-laws. So Frieda was my grandmother-in-law, and a lot of what I learned at centenarians and how they are presented, I've learned through her. And this is how she drinks resveratrol from the bottle at her 100-year-old birthday. And she was really quite an incredible person. And she was healthy basically until 2 weeks before she died. It was hard to always tell any doctor who saw her that she's not taking medications, right? It was like, what are you taking? Nothing. No, you don't understand. In the morning, with breakfast. No, I understand you. I'm still taking nothing. So she's an inspiration, and also I would summarize by saying that I think if we prevent aging, we can prevent age-related diseases, that the research to the biology of genetics of aging is bearing fruits and medications. I gave an example. And also the point that healthy aging is not going to destroy us necessarily. There is a balance. There are things to do. I want to just mention that Carol Stam is our research coordinatorship. Can you wave? And if you know of centenarians, if you're interested in the study, if you're offspring of centenarians, we're going to hang around here and we'll be happy to take your names and know more about it. And just to remind you that our goal is to prevent the chronic debilitating age-related disease. We're really about quality of life. And when we have the drugs, they might have a side effect of living long, and we'll apologize for that. So thank you for listening. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and I'll stay around for some questions.